Last time we talked about the Roman Empire's first major external crisis and prelude to the later barbarian invasions, the Marcomannic Wars. But Marcus Aurelius, often hailed as the Platonic ideal of a philosopher king, almost stubbornly kept fighting for nearly 15 years, almost his entire reign. Were his hands tied, or did he have greater ambitions? And how could Commodus create such a stable order on the Danube while Marcus Aurelius didn't? That is today's topic, for which we'll talk about the possible motivations of all war parties, barbarian and Roman alike, while also looking at the peace treaties signed under Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, and how their goals manifested in them. But I won't have any detailed accounts of the conduct of war. For that, please watch the prior video. This video will be more of an academic overview and analysis than usual, so I hope you really learned something, but I'll try to stay entertaining. I quite liked researching this topic, and I hope so do you. So let us now begin with the motivation of the invaders themselves. We do not have any written sources from them, and because the barbarian coalition was so diverse, it is not unreasonable to think that every tribe had its own goals and even different factions within the tribes had different goals. But there are some theories on general motivations. In the prior video, I've already described how Rome's state of weakness caused by the Parthian War and the following Antonine Plague that devastated Rome made such invasions even feasible. I'm not alone in thinking this. The German historian deditio drew a similar conclusion in 1998. But first I would like to reiterate how devastating the Antonine Plague was. So yeah, after some idiot legionary opened Pandora's box, okay, that story is probably just a product of historian Augustus' author listing out his Reddit Greek mythology brain juice on some paper, we got the Antonine Plague. It was probably not the plague, but rather smallpox. Still very deadly though. The military carried it, so obviously it was greatly affected, although the provinces too suffered, including the breadbasket of the empire. No, not Africa this time, though it was affected, but Egypt I mean. Italy too experienced great losses. The mean fatality rate might have been 25 to 30%, rising to 40 to 50% in the very young and the very old, according to Richard Duncan Jones in 2018. Enslaved people were also hit especially hard, like in other pandemics. Heck, even livestock died, but I am repeating myself from last episode. So yeah, many deaths, especially in the army. It's needless to say that dead people cannot serve in the army, except as corpse kebabs for intimidation, which the Romans didn't do, and corpses can only pay taxes once at most. Yet truly a state of weakness, and that's not even counting the legions, including the Nubian legions that perished in the war itself. But that's just what made invasion possible. What was the actual reasoning for invading? After all, breaking the important trade links with Rome was quite the price to pay. As we last episode learned, often but not always highly unreliable historian Augusta in Vita Marci 14.1 describes how barbarians come from the north pushed the different tribes involved in Marcomannic Wars towards Rome. Clad in the military cloak, the two emperors finally set forth. For now, not only were the victorially in Marcomanni throwing everything into confusion, but other tribes, who had been driven on by the more distant barbarians and had retreated before them, were ready to attack Italy if not peaceably received. Some historians such as Anthony Burley interpret this as the Goths of the migration from the Baltic to the Black Sea pushing these tribes towards Rome. The aforementioned deditio, however, saw this as only one part of a larger explanation. In 1998 he said, in German of course, but I'll translate for you all, "The Great Departure is much more to be understood as the sum of an immeasurable amount of divergences and dissolutions, unions, border coalitions, remeltings and new formations of ethnic unities." All that to say, new groups were being formed. I imagine they scared the Romans, which will be discussed in the next chapter of this video. According to Timpe, there was everything from smaller migration groups to great migration avalanches, as he put it. Their goal would have been land and money, which they hoped to get from Rome due to a state of weakness at the threat of war. However, it remains unclear whether they wanted land to settle within the framework of the Roman Empire, as later groups during the Great Migration period aimed to do, although in families without being broken up into smaller chunks, or to establish new kingdoms, as happened once the Western Roman system disintegrated. It definitely wasn't a Germanic conspiracy out of fear for the power of Rome though, unlike the story Augustin Vita Marci 22.1 suggests. The still alive and probably unproblematic German historian Michael Stahl, never mind, yeah, no, I cannot endorse those views. Absolutely horrible stuff. Especially the Erklärung 2018 BS, what some might even call open racism, which I however cannot for legal reasons. However, he published a pretty well made and peer-reviewed paper where he said that from natural factors such as climate change and soil depletion, in addition to social factors such as stronger social differentiation, resulting population pressure force entire tribes or parts of tribes to search for new livelihoods. The population pressure in question is the population growth among the elite and commoners alike. So yeah, the Germanic and Sarmatian savages wanted to replace us Aryan Romans in our own country. Although due to a literal pandemic waiting from maybe China, in which case it might of course have followed the Han dynasty, all the way to Rome, an important trading partner for the barbarians. Yeah, no, I'm not really convinced personally. According to him, there would have also been two factions between the barbarians. Those who wanted to use this opportunity to expand their own power base independently from Rome, and those who wanted a closer relationship to Rome. They too wanted money, which was less a tribute or regular sustentation by Rome, and actually more of a diplomatic gift, to tie the barbarian ruler to Rome, in Stahl's eyes. Roman coins, after all, he continues, were valuable not just due to their metal content, but also the prestige they brought as any other Roman luxury object. Now you could come up with even more theories, but we honestly just don't know their motives and can only speculate. I guess you could try to disprove various theories until we reach some kind of truth, like a historiographical version of Cartesian doubt, but even then, I don't think we'd arrive anywhere. Although, as far as I'm aware, the Marcomanni did also have pineal glands, but that's neither here nor there. Besides, there were different factions, as I said, there probably wasn't a universal motive. So then, what were the motivations of the Romans and their different factions then? A common objective in wars seems to be to restore a prior favorable status quo. In my last video I did not talk about the possible status quo for time reasons and because I wanted to focus on the conduct of war. Also a handword up on the theater, honestly. But now I did, so what was the status quo before the order on the Danube broke apart? There are several perspectives. The still alive and kicking Hungarian historian Peter Kovacs wrote in 2009 that the sources agree in reporting that the vassalage system, standing firmly since the reign of Trajan and Hadrian, had collapsed all of a sudden, and the peoples neighboring the empire demanded reception and acceptance into the empire, together and at the same time. Although it must be mentioned that not all historians agree with this notion of a vassalage or client system on the Danube. The aforementioned and definitely unproblematic Michael Stahl made an interesting argument that is as follows. It was not a client relationship, which would have consisted of a commitment by the contractual partner to defend the limes in question and the allocation of troops in exchange for guarantee by Rome that the client state was inviolable. Importantly too, it would not have been the tribe itself that was a contract partner, but rather the king of this tribe, who normally would have also had Roman citizenship. Rather, according to him, it was a diplomatic relationship sui generis, a unique one, that gave Rome influence but not sufficient control to consider them client states. Rome would have not wanted to assert such a control either. Instead, Rome, or specifically Marcus Aurelius and later Commodus, aimed to strengthen the borders of the provinces by weakening the peoples on the other side of the Danube, but simultaneously strengthening them eternally for stability. He continues that these treaties also dealt with the regulation of cross-border traffic with them, and through the recruitment of auxiliary troops, personal ties with the king, hostage-taking, the exchange of envoys, and establishing channels through which regular information exchange and influence could be exerted if necessary, all to stabilize the frontier. In simpler language, the treaties aimed at stabilization of the frontier by stabilizing the relationship with the barbarians rather than necessarily subjugating them. Little spoiler, but even before reading his paper I thought that this was a very plausible explanation, at least for Commodus, and I will conclude something similar for Commodus later on. But yeah, if such a vassalage or old client system actually existed beforehand, the restoration of it definitely would have been a very logical war goal. Otherwise, the special diplomatic relationship, as described by Stahl, too would be a viable goal to pursue rather than annexations. The Hungarian-German historian Géza Alföldi too argued in 1971 that the peace treaties of Marcus Aurelius, which I will discuss in the next chapter, show that the goal had been the restoration of a buffer zone of client states on the northern border of the empire, rather than annexations. A quote by Appian of Alexandria regarding the diplomacy of Antoninus Pius might support this by establishing a precedence for a client-state system that still persisted under Pius, reportedly. The emperors, in addition to the original provinces, have added some further areas to their rule and have suppressed some which broke away. In general, possessing by good government the most important parts of land and sea, they prefer to preserve the empire rather than to extend it indefinitely to poor and profitless barbarian peoples. I have seen embassies from some of these in Rome offering themselves as subjects and the emperor refusing them, on the grounds that they would be of no use to him. For other peoples, limitless in number, the emperors appoint the kings, not requiring them for the empire. On some of the provinces, they spend more than they receive, thinking it shameful to give them up even though they are loss-making. They surround the emperor with a circle of great camps, and guard so great an area of land and sea like an estate. Basically, Why overextend through direct annexation and then bureaucracy if client states will do? Maybe Marcus shared the view of further provinces being useless additions to the empire, or maybe not, because the view that he wanted to establish 2 new provinces, Marcomanni and Sarmatia, as the story Augustus describes them, is also quite common. Anthony Burley, for example, also draws from Catus Dio's book 72:34.4, and if he had lived longer, he would have subdued all that region. And on book 27.20.1, where there is a description of how the Romans under Marcus Aurelius built bathhouses and other amenities in enemy territory, suggesting a planned permanent occupation. Our good uncontroversial friend Michael Stahl, however, interpreted this not as an argument for annexations, but rather said, the goal of endeavor was to monitor embarrassingly closely that the Marcomanni and Quadi complied with the treaty articles. However, there were apparently also medals with inscription Propagatores Imperii, enlarger of the empire made. This would also suggest that the plan was annexations, or at least a much stronger presence in the client states than before. The also British Fergus Miller wrote all the way back in 1982 that such plans are not to be dismissed by saying that, though the gradually growing predominance of defensive warfare is undeniable, the ideal of conquest was not wholly abandoned. We need not disbelieve the historian Augustus' claim that Marcus eventually intended to create 2 new provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia, beyond the Danube. Another argument to be had in favor of annexations is that around 165, the Legio II Italica and Legio III Italica were recruited in Italy of all places, as we learned last episode. The recruitment of new legions often happened before wars of conquest, such as under Caligula, Vespasian, Domitian, Trajan, and even still Septimius Severus, as Alfaldi argued in 1971. However, there are several possible motives for this recruitment. According to Kovac, these could be the replacement of the Legio IX Hispania and the Legio XXII Deiotarriana, which were destroyed in the Parthian War, a replacement for the legions still deployed east, a garrison for Raetia and Noricum, a preparation for war with the Germanics, or, which Kovacs found quite unlikely, to pursue such plans of conquest. There's also another possible motive that I find highly likely and that isn't mutually exclusive with annexations. And that would be that Rome's interest, as Timper put it, was still unchanged, focused on the stabilization and the halting of a fluctuation, and the war ended with the Marcomanni and Quadi were tranquilized for good. In my opinion, this could have been accomplished through annexing the tribes and stopping the fluctuations and the rise of larger confederations that way, or by weakening them and strengthening Roman oversight over certain or all tribes as clients. While I'm personally unsure which one of these Marcus tried to achieve, I'm pretty confident in that Commodus wanted the latter, which we will see when we look at the peace treaties he signed. Another theory I'm personally fond of is the following. Marcus Aurelius wanted to make up for the losses of the Antonine Plague by settling barbarian tribes in the empire, possibly smaller ones. This did actually happen during his reign. The historian Augustus reports that he settled innumerable foreigners on Roman soil. Catus Dio gives more detail. Besides these that came to Marcus, many others sent envoys, some by tribes and some by nations, and offered to surrender. Some of them were sent on campaigns elsewhere, as were also the captives and deserters who were fit for service. Others received land in Dacia, Pannonia, Moesia, the province of Germania, and in Italy itself. Some of them now, who settled at Ravenna, made an uprising and even went so far as to seize possession of the city, and for this reason Marcus did not again bring any of the barbarians into Italy, but even banished those who had previously come there. As we can see here, he stopped the policy of settling barbarians in Italy once they revolted, but not in the rest of the empire. It should also be noted that many of the barbarian tribes that did settle within the empire were from then on content, because while Rome received the settlers it needed, they received the receptio and land they had demanded. The Navisti too received land according to Cassius Dio, and the Navisti, who had suffered hardships, at one and at the same time deserted to the number of 3,000 and received land in our territory. Last episode we also learned that 5,500 Iazyges were sent to Britain as auxiliary troops, and they must have lived somewhere. Him wanting to settle the Quadi in the empire could also explain why he forbade them from migrating north to the also Suebic Semnones. Burley, in my opinion, brilliantly put it when he said, to Marcus, land without inhabitants would be useless. The empire itself was no longer in need of fresh areas to settle. rather the reverse, as the settlements of barbarians in Italy itself and the provinces demonstrate. Marcus wanted to Romanize the Marcomanni, Quadi and Iazyges, not merely acquire their land. While I'm not convinced that Marcus actually wanted to annex the lands with the Quadi still living on it rather than settle them in the current borders of the empire, I find it highly logical that if he wanted to annex more lands, he would have wanted the people on the lands to remain there, rather than settling the lands with Romans while the empire itself was already depopulated. He needed taxpayers, not Lebensraum. Lebensraum for the Western journalists in my audience is what you might call a buffer/security zone following preemptive self-defense. No, Luca! You can't make anti-Semitic jokes against Israel. Are you an evil Hamas supporter? Did you know Marcus Aurelius was actually Israeli? Weil Hadrian was evil ancient Hamas. That right now was completely spontaneous, this was not in my script. Anyway, a middle ground could be that he wanted to annex them and move some barbarians into other provinces, while keeping some on their own lands. But just because it's a mix of two possibilities doesn't make it correct or more likely. Now I presented quite a few arguments in favor of and against annexation. While it seems that annexation seems to be the most prominent position, there are still many academics who argue against it, as we have also seen. We have additionally seen other possible motives, such as settlement or restoring a prior diplomatic relationship by weakening the barbarians. Now let us take a look at the peace treaties actually made by first Marcus Aurelius and then Commodus, to see how the goals of the Romans might reflect in those and which goals they might have been ready to compromise on. As mentioned last episode, in 170 Marcus Aurelius made a peace with the Quadi. Let us look at this one a little closer. Cassius Dio described it as follows. Marcus Antoninus remained in Pannonia in order to give audience to the embassies of the barbarians. The Quadi, among others, asked for peace, which was granted them, both in the hope that they might be detached from the Marcomanni and also because they gave him many horses and cattle and promised to surrender all the deserters and the captives. Besides, 13,000 at first, later all the others as well. The right to attend the markets, however, was not granted to them, for fear that the Iazyges and the Marcomanni, whom they had sworn not to receive nor to allow to pass through the country, should mingle with them, and passing themselves off for Quadi should reconnaître the Roman positions and purchase provisions. Damn a wine. Here we can see the classical principle of divide et impera, or in English, divide and conquer. Something we will see in all peace treaties was the return of prisoners, but that was just common practice in general. The provision of resources would also be a common theme, as we shall see. To summarize, this treaty of course concluded a peace, cattle was provided to Rome, deserters and prisoners were returned, the Quadi were prohibited from visiting provincial markets, and the Marcomanni and Iazyges were isolated. Our favorite and problematic historian Stahl also pleads that one can deduce from a passage that unauthorized border crossings were also prohibited. In his mediations, Marcus Aurelius said the following supporting this. We must build a great limes to keep out all the Quadi. Remigration, my friends, is the motto. We must keep out these Islamo-leftist influences. Save Europa and Srejcha too. Auxiliaries were also provided to Rome, while the Quadi and other barbarians received land to settle within the empire. Some of them were sent on campaigns elsewhere, as were also the captives and deserters who were fit for service. Others received land in Dacia, Pannonia, Moesia, the province of Germania, and in Italy itself. As mentioned earlier in the video, after an uprising in Ravenna they were kicked out from Italy, but they still received land in the other provinces. The Quadi also soon broke the treaty after a coup. According to Cassius Dio, they were not carrying out any of the agreements, but surely that won't be a recurring pattern. Wait, we already did that bit last time. As we saw last episode, the treaties often didn't last for long. Stahl's solution to this problem is the following. Rather than establishing provinces, the goal was, as he says, to motivate these tribes through massive pressure and direct support of friends of Rome to respect the treaties for good, thus maintaining the relationship of jus gentium that existed until now. Interestingly though, he talks about how this order, including the stationing of legions, might have resulted in a long-term provincialization. This would have happened through the destruction of procedures and institutions which the self-government of tribes depended on, and the shift of all political decisions to the commanders of legions as the real bearers of power. Rome would have been in a position that would have made the official acquisition of the tasks of government and the creation of provincial structures inevitable. Now, away from the Quadi, Marcus Aurelius soon also made peace with the Marcomanni in 172, a very interesting one indeed. Perhaps it was a deditio, that is, in autonomous states, nominally, always voluntary surrender of sovereignty to Rome, as Ernst Bardian defined it. It entailed Rome being able to do with a community that surrendered as it saw fit because it became a property of Rome. Additionally, all members in the community had to subscribe to this channel, while chiefs had to share to help Rome with the algorithm. However, prior agreements, despite becoming invalid, were usually kept because otherwise it could have been legally pursued, probably as a breach of fides, that is trust. Cassius Maya said this regarding the matter. Marcus subdued the Marcomanni and the Iazyges after many hard struggles and dangers. Now to me, the deditio seems to be a specific process I can't read out from here, but both Peter Kene and Peter Kovacs mentioned the term deditio, the latter defining it to be annexation as opposed to a minority faction of Romans arguing for footnotes, a treaty. They both had more expertise than I currently do, so yeah, a deditio could have been a possibility, I suppose. Kene even wrote an article about ancient diplomacy, which I however have no access to, sorry. Now my personal guess for why a deditio, according to the still alive German historian Werner Dahlheim, a deditio could guarantee that the worst effects of occupation could be averted. You know how brutal ancient occupations could be: sackings, slavery, sexual violence, all that horrible stuff that would never happen today in places such as Sudan or the Congo. How do you surrender voluntarily? Through a deditio. Although it didn't guarantee it necessarily, because the subject of a deditio would become a property of Rome. It was basically an annexation except nominally voluntary. An alternative explanation is that perhaps it was to settle some Marcomanni on Roman soil. Making barbarian settlers the subjects of the deditio was essential for all barbarian tribes that were settled in Rome until Theodosius I broke the custom when he settled the Goths in Thracia without a prior deditio. Well, that is what it says on the German Wikipedia page for deditio, without a citation. And I don't have the time to read through the entire bibliography, so take that fear of mine with a lot of salt large enough to make Carthage infertile. Now that is just the legal procedure, however. What were the actual terms? According to Kovacs, the terms were as following. A buffer zone of 10 Roman miles was supposed to be established across the Danube. This was however revised to 5 Roman miles in 174, as a reward for actually fulfilling the end of a bargain, as Cassius Dio reported. In modern units this would be around 14.8 kilometers and 7.4 kilometers respectively. Hostages were also exchanged and they had a Roman-friendly king installed. According to the story Augusta, plunder was also returned to the provinces, however perhaps that's just glazed with nearly 300 years after the fact. Stahl also adds that auxiliary troops were recruited, settlers received some land in the empire, it was forbidden to cross into the lands of the Quadi, the right to assembly, and I assume things, was limited, they had to make contributions to Rome and return prisoners, and finally they could not have their own fleet on the Danube and not use the islands of the Danube. The crucial trade with Rome, however, remained prohibited. However, as a reward for fulfilling these terms, in 174 they also could visit Roman markets again, in addition to the buffer zone being revised as mentioned previously. A lot of these points Stahl reduced for analogy with the treaty with the Iazyges in 175, due to Cassius Dio mentioning that the terms were basically the same. I guess we should talk about the peace with the Iazyges in 175, although they would have made peace a year prior if Marcus had led them. Good thing for them that Avidius Cassius rose up. Otherwise Marcus might have released the scourge virus on them, as Cassius Dio reported. But he didn't, so I want to say, you are a good man, Arthur Aurelius. Although Anthony Burley disagreed with Dio's notion that Marcus, both because he knew their ways to be untrustworthy and also because he had been deceived by the Quadi, wished to annihilate them utterly. Anthony Burley said this in response to that, which I find quite reasonable. To Marcus, land without inhabitants would be useless. The empire itself was no longer in need of fresh areas to settle, rather the reverse, as the settlements of barbarians in Italy itself and the provinces demonstrate. Now the question of whether Marcus wanted to commit genocide or not aside, what were these terms of the Iazyges? According to Stahl, in addition to the points imposed upon the Marcomanni, there was a prohibition on passing through Roman Dacia, a 20 Roman mile buffer zone, and Rome would have to approve of kings. They also had to return 100,000 Roman prisoners according to Cassius Dio, which seems a tad bit high perhaps. Additionally, 8,000 horsemen were given to Rome, of which 5,500 were sent to Britannia as we learned last time. These points were later revised in 179 after the Iazyges were possibly made foederati alongside the Buri and proved useful to Marcus Aurelius. The buffer zone was removed, The Iazyges could not trade with Rome, but only in Canton, certain marketplaces on certain days, and finally they could pass through Dacia with the permission of the Roman governor. As for the Quadi in 174, well, the by the Romans unrecognized King Iazyges was deposed, but according to deditio not killed, merely sent to Alexandria, despite the huge bounty of $15.25 on the Quadi.
Don't forget the court.
We mentioned last episode. Although life was preferred over that anyway, so I guess it does add up in the end. The rest was the same as the original conditions imposed on the Marcomanni. Now we have talked about all the treaties with the major tribes by Marcus Aurelius. I'll also talk about the minor ones soon enough, after talking about Commodus. So now we can reduce a treaty by Marcus Aurelius to these points. In its most simple form, Marcus Aurelius always aimed to isolate the tribes from each other, to create a buffer zone of 5 to 10 Roman miles on the other side of the Danube, the installation of a Roman-friendly king, the return of captives and deserters, and often to prohibit access to Roman markets, which to me at least seems like a bargaining chip to war tribes that fulfilled these points. We have also seen that auxiliaries were provided often, although not always. Smaller parts of tribes were also settled in the empire, which we will also see when quickly addressing the treaties made with smaller tribes. Now, in addition to the most basic form of an Antonine peace I deduced, started a splendid job dividing it into 3 larger categories: the conclusion of peace itself, the interference in tribes' autonomy, and finally, rules regarding the relationship to Rome. However, I think it is appropriate to talk about Commodus first because his peace is included in this. As we have learned before, Marcus Aurelius died in 180 while preparing for another campaign, due to the peace having broken apart around 177. While the ancient sources accused Commodus of rejecting the advice of his expert advisors Marcus had left him, and stabbing the Roman Reich in the back by instantly making peace with the barbarians, even though Commodus might easily have destroyed them, he in fact actually continued the war for another couple of months, and only then made peace with the Marcomanni and Quadi. Alright, thanks Luca from the past. So what did this peace look like? deditio reports this. In addition to the conditions that his father had imposed upon them, he also demanded that they restore to him the deserters and the captives that they had taken in the meantime, and that they furnish annually a stipulated amount of grain, a demand from which he subsequently released them. Moreover, he obtained some arms from them and soldiers as well, 13,000 from the Quadi and a smaller number from the Marcomanni, and in return for these, he relieved them of the requirement of an annual levy. However, he further commanded that they should not assemble often nor in many parts of the country, but only once each month and in one place, and in the presence of a Roman centurion, and furthermore, that they should not make war upon the Iazyges, the Bubai, or the Vandali. On these terms then, he made peace and abandoned all the outposts in the country beyond the strip along the frontier that had been neutralized. In short, he pulled back the occupation his father had established in Marcomanni and Quadi, but in exchange, prisoners and deserters were returned as usual, and when grain deliveries were established that the Marcomanni and Quadi would soon be freed of, however, the handover of weapons, the one-time provision of auxiliary troops, no wars with the Roman allies of the Iazyges, Buai and Vandals, and finally, tribal assemblies, I assume things, could only be held once a month under the supervision of a Roman centurion subscribed to the channel, so not too dissimilar from his father's treaties. However, we can see here, lots of oversight, but several olive branches were extended too. The prohibition on visiting Roman markets is notably absent here. The Marcomanni and Quadi were no longer occupied, but at the same time, assemblies were under Roman supervision, which I guess guaranteed that the barbarians wouldn't get any funky ideas during debates, while also dividing the tribes, which to me seemed like they had only been recently consolidating somewhat for strategic gain. This strategy seems to me to have been both more respectful to the tribes, while also being cheaper than a permanent occupation. Commodus' new but not so different order held out for several decades until the middle of the 3rd century when it broke apart for obvious reasons. So this makes one wonder whether Commodus was truly a better diplomat by being more lenient, as the sources describe him, even though his terms do not seem radically different. Perhaps the Romans under Marcus Aurelius were actually a bit too aggressive. While the sources do not mention this, considering that Marcus Aurelius could actually establish a peace when Avidius Catus was up, it makes me wonder whether the Romans were actually the reason war broke out over and over again due to not having yet finished what they set out to do. Or perhaps by this point the barbarian invaders did really lose their will to fight, with many anti-Roman leaders having been done away with, and Commodus' terms only worked because the Romans had firmly gained the upper hand by then. So compared to what could have been, the barbarians realized this was the best deal they could have gotten after all. Goals shift in a war over time after all. And after all, I do not think Marcus Aurelius anticipated that the Quadi would break the end of the bargain while he was returning to Rome, so I don't really think he was the one starting wars. Although I imagine his interactions with Pertinax went like this. Oh, come on, the Quadi attacked us again! Wait, Marcus, this is good news! We can commit war crimes. You can become like Big Yahoo.
Mark, this is good news.
Your son will live for 30 years. This is insane!
Mark.
Look, he will make an ostrich steak. A steak?! Yeah, probably went something like that. But we can only speculate why the earlier pieces didn't work, but this one by Commodus did. I think it would be appropriate to look at Stahl's summary of the general Antonine peace template to compare the actual peace treaties made for these speculations. Let us begin with his conclusion of peace. Firstly, the amicitia, that is friendship to Rome, was restored. Then, prisoners, deserters, loot and weapons were delivered to Rome. And lastly, he just says contributions, which, looking at earlier pages, I assume refers to anything from cattle to hostages and even perishable food such as grain and
protein tubes with that white sauce.
And a steak.
A steak!
Next up, the interference in the autonomy of tribes, as he says, or as I would say, the guarantee of Roman hegemony. Firstly, of course, the approval of kings, nothing surprising there. Then, however, also limiting the freedom of assembly and requiring the presence of a centurion, as Commodus but not Marcus Aurelius did. Foreign policy-wise, movement was limited, while wars and coalitions were completely banned. Lastly, we have arrangements regarding the relations with Rome, which is subdivided into three categories. Firstly, prohibitions and guidelines, which include a prohibition on unauthorized border crossings and other guidelines regarding traffic across borders. The buffer zones we talked about, a ban on having a Danube navy, and finally, guidelines on trade with the Romans. Secondly, we have contributions again, such as the transfer of hostages, auxiliary troops, and wheat. Stahl himself mentioned cattle in earlier treaties, so I am unsure why he is limiting himself to just grain here, which to me seems somewhat unique to Commodus anyway. Lastly, he mentions a single concession on Rome's side, the allocation of land on Roman soil for settlers. Now, I think it needs to be mentioned that none of these policies were implemented all at once. Commodus got rid of the buffer zones except for the Boii and didn't address regulations on markets. While Marcus Aurelius didn't require a centurion to supervise things and thus limit tribal intrigues, although later he permanently occupied Marcomannia and Quadi. Was this Marcus Aurelius' mistake? Not knowing how to actually maintain his clients by stabilizing tribes internally, but under pro-Roman client kings? Well, he had more success with smaller tribes, so let us look at the treaties Marcus Aurelius and Commodus made with them. Let us start with the Cotini all the way back in 171. They decided to ally with the Romans upon receiving Terutanius Paternus, the secretary in charge of the emperor's Latin correspondence, on the pretext that they wished to make a campaign with him against the Marcomanni. Not only failed to do so, but even treated Paternus himself shamefully with great contempt, thereby bringing about their own destruction later in poor quality copper, as Cassius reports. At the same time, the Stingy Vandals tried to ally the Romans but failed. Yet, they still attacked the Roman hostile Costa Boccae, just to then also attack Roman Dacia, until the allies, the Lequinti, betrayed them in fear of a Roman response, going on to then score a decisive victory against them. As a result, the Stingy committed no further acts of hostility against the Romans, but in response to urgent supplications addressed to Marcus, they received from him both money and the privilege of asking for land in case they should inflict some injury upon those who were then fighting against him. Now this tribe really did fulfill some of its promises, Cassius Dio tells us. Surely this is the last time the Stingy Vandals will be relevant in Roman history. Now let us talk about the Boii, who made peace with Marcus Aurelius in 179 and a year later with Commodus in 180. In 979 they were made foederati alongside the Iazyges in exchange for Rome weakening the enemy, the Quadi. The Iazyges sent an embassy and asked to be released from certain of the agreements they had made, and some concessions were granted them to prevent their becoming entirely alienated. Yet neither they nor the Boii were willing to join the Romans as allies until they had received pledges from Marcus that he would without fail prosecute the war to the uttermost. For they were afraid he might make a treaty with the Quadi as before and leave enemies dwelling at their doors. However, this alliance seems to not have lasted, for Cassius Dio describes how Commodus also made peace with them, suggesting that they were at war. Commodus granted peace to the Boii when they sent envoys. Previously, he had declined to do so in spite of their frequent requests, because they were strong and because it was not peace that they wanted, but the securing of a respite to enable them to make further preparations. But now that they were exhausted, he made peace with them, receiving hostages and getting back many captives from the Boer themselves, as well as 15,000 from the others, and he compelled the others to take an oath that they would never dwell in nor use for pasturage a 5-mile strip of the territory next to Dacia. So yeah, the typical return of prisoners, the provision of hostages and a buffer zone, which seems a bit weird for a Commodian peace, but what do I know. Before we talk about the Dacians, I'd also just like to remind you that around 179 to 180, 3,000 Iazyges were settled in the Roman Empire. Lastly then, the same Sabinianus. Meant is Gaius Vettius Sabinianus Julius Hospes, governor of Dacia, also when 12,000 of the neighboring Dacians had been driven out of their own country and were on the point of aiding the others, dissuaded them from their purpose, promising them that some land in our Dacia should be given to them. In short, the Dacians had trouble at home, threatened to aid Rome's enemies, and then Sabinianus decided to settle 12,000 of them in Dacia to calm them. And those were all the treaties pretty much. So to summarize then, to answer our question why Commodus succeeded while his father did not, last episode we took a look at the reality on the ground, while in this one we first reiterated the destruction caused by the Antonine Plague, to then conclude that this state of weakness caused by it and the Parthian War made an invasion possible in the first place. We then looked at the possible motives for the barbarians to invade, especially the role of Gothic migrations to the Black Sea and how this led to the barbarian desire for receptio. We also saw how the prior diplomatic order seems to have broken apart, although whether it was a client system or its own special relationship between Rome and these barbarian tribes seems to still be a matter of discussion. Afterwards we looked at the possible Roman war goals, most notably annexations, but also the restoration of the supposed client system, the weakening of these emerging tribal confederations, and the settlement of barbarians in the empire to alleviate the burden caused by the Antonine Plague. Finally, the largest portion of the video was dedicated to the peace treaties actually made, to see how these goals manifested or did not manifest in them. Buffer zones, Roman-friendly kings, return of captives and deserters, restricted market access and all that other shizzle. So now to answer the question. Commodus clearly had peace in mind, as we have seen, and he has also been accused of. However, I think that due to him continuing with the war, it is clear that he wanted a permanent settlement, not yet another armistice to be broken. His final peace doesn't seem radically different from his father's attempts at peace. Perhaps the presence of a centurion truly was the oversight needed. Or perhaps both sides at this point were tired of the war. Alternatively, the barbarians might never have been the problem and it was the Romans that broke the peace. But I at least doubt that Marcus Aurelius is to blame, due to that whole episode when he made peace with the Quadi and wanted to return to Rome, just to have to go back to the front a cold minute later due to the Iazyges coup. So I would like to ask you, why do you think Marcus Aurelius failed while Commodus succeeded? Was Commodus lucky with the timing because his enemies had already been beaten half dead? Was it that the barbarians knew they were about to be utterly defeated? Did he successfully divide the coalition enough that the Marcomanni and Quadi were truly isolated? Or was it something else entirely, like Marcus' goal not having actually been peaced just yet? Please write it and other ideas down in the comments. Man, I think it's safe to say I've now dedicated more time to the Marcomannic Wars than pretty much anyone else that isn't a historian of classical antiquity, and perhaps even more than many of them. Niche topics, so if you know anyone else interested in this topic, sharing it would be pretty appreciated, but it's not like I actually care anything. If you're interested in crises Rome faced, I'm working on a series precisely on every existential crisis Rome faced here on the right. Okay, that was all I had to say. My throat needs a break, especially after sucking off Commodus this much. Valete!